Um, Let me start off by introducing myself. My name is Peter Stern. I'm with what we call the Product Policy Team in Menlo Park, California. I'm a lawyer by training, and I practiced in a large international law firm in the United States and Asia for about 20 years, and then moved over to Facebook in 2014 and joined the policy team. So even though I have a legal background, and we frequently discuss legal issues, I'm not a lawyer for the company. And what I'm going to be talking to you about today is the policy approach that we have to dealing with hate speech on our platform. By the end of my talk and the Q&A, I hope that you will have a good understanding of what our team is, how we operate, how we develop our policies, the inputs that go into the policy, and then the specific substance of our hate speech policy. I'd like to discuss that with you in some detail so you have a sense of the contours of it and perhaps how it maps to some of the definitions that have been presented today. And then I'll also touch on some specific European issues that I thought would be of interest to you based on discussions with my colleagues here in the European region. So let me give you a quick overview of Facebook. I won't get bogged down in a lot of facts and figures, but I do want to draw out some important themes from both our mission and from the scale of our operations. Our mission, our goal, is to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together. This kind of sets up both the notion of borderless communication that will be a theme of my remarks today, and it also starts to draw out some of the balancing that we must do between different values. Sometimes they may be in tension when it comes to freedom of expression and keeping people safe online. When Anne was making her remarks, I was very much struck by how similar that seemed. Much of it resonated with me in terms of the line drawing, the often very difficult line drawing that we need to do in our policy work. So that all is an outgrowth of our mission. Here's some facts and figures on the scale of Facebook. I draw attention to this for two reasons. One is that the scale obviously is massive, and in developing our policies, it's extremely important that we are able to enforce those policies. Many times in our policy discussions, we'll reflect on how feasible it will be to enforce certain policy elements that we are considering. If we can't enforce the policies, it's not going to work for us. We need to go back to the drawing board, or we need to talk to the enforcement folks and come to an understanding about how we're going to actually implement the policies that we come up with. The other thing that I want to focus on is the figure of 87% down in the bottom left. But that figure of 87% is very important because that's the percentage of users of Facebook who are outside the United States. This means that we can't be bound by U.S. mindsets, U.S. laws, U.S. policies. We have to be global. And in particular, it means that our policies need to operate on a global basis. We're often asked what law or legal regime our policies are tied to. And when I say our policies, I'm referring to what we call our community standards. You may be familiar with them from seeing online. And community standards and also the ads guidelines that we prepare. But mostly today I'm going to be talking about the community standards. We're asked, what law is the community standards based on? The answer is that those are global policies that apply around the world. A series of inputs go into them. They're informed by legal determinations, legal judgments, but they're not pegged to any one law in particular. They couldn't be if we were going to be a truly global enterprise and operate on a global scale. We're mindful and respectful of local law in ways that I'll explain, but our policies are global given the global nature of our user base. So now let's talk about content policy. The product policy team is the team that makes the rules for what people can share on Facebook, as I noted. And the most important element of that, the one that I'm going to be focusing on today, is content policy. That's the group that sits in offices around the world that meets to develop the policies, to test them with outside experts, to consult with our internal enforcement team, and to ultimately develop the policies that we enforce on a worldwide basis. The content policy team is probably more than 40 people now. The overall product policy team is on the order of 70 people in various offices throughout the world, including, of course, Europe. So I want to draw attention to a couple of other important elements in regard to our policies. As I mentioned, they're global in nature, and that means we're often in the position of trying to balance or accommodate differing values and interests in different countries in the world. If you think of a policy area like nudity, for example, obviously values and social mores are going to be very different in the Nordics than they are in Southeast Asia. We need to come up with an approach on that policy area that works for our global community. And so we're often in the process of trying to come up with a system that will best allow us to navigate between often very strongly held views throughout the world. Another thing that's very important that I'm going to be drawing attention to throughout my remarks today is the importance of context. We're often in the position of needing to know as much as possible about how content is being shared, what goes into that content, and other elements of that content so that we can make a good decision about that. That means that we need reviewers who have the proper language skills. It means that we need people who understand language and culture on our broad policy team. That's one reason the team has expanded in recent years and why it now sits all throughout the world so that we can get the best expertise possible to bring that to bear in developing the policies. Okay, let me now turn to some of the specific policies that are included in the community standards. Hate speech is one. That's definitely one that we're going to talk about today. But there are a series of interlocking policies that I want people to get a sense of. And this is not an exhaustive list. If you go to our website and see the community standards, you'll see in detail all of the policy areas that we cover. But I think it's very important to grasp that the policies work together, and that if content isn't covered by one policy, it may well be covered. For example, we've been talking today about hate speech and incitement to violence. As I'll indicate, one thing that really struck me today about the discussion was the question of whether hate speech has to be violent in order to cross the line and merit a takedown. I mean, I suppose on some level you could take the position that all hate speech is violent and then it becomes kind of a tautology. But the point to make is that we don't require a specific incitement to violence in order to meet the criteria for hate speech under our policies. We'll remove content as hate speech well before it crosses the line into actually calling for violence. But the important thing I think to note is that calls for violence, threats of violence may well be covered by other policies that we have. We have a policy that's referred to here as direct threats or credible violence, which may not be hate speech, but it may still be taken down. For example, if I identify a specific person and I make clear an intent to threaten them, to harm them in a specific way, with reference to a particular date and time, perhaps a weapon, we'll remove that, and we may even notify law enforcement, even if it doesn't constitute hate speech. That's an example of how the policies work together and inform our overall approach. So let me now turn to some of the building blocks, if you will, of our policy approach. To be successful, our policies have to be principled, operable, and explicable, and I'm going to explain more about each of these. The notion of principles really lies at the core of our policies, so I'm going to say a little bit about this. As other speakers were referring to, we need to have in mind the important values of freedom of expression, as well as protection for people who may be vulnerable. The far left circle here represents safety. We know that if people feel that they'll be unsafe when they come to Facebook, they won't come to the platform. They won't share what's important to them, their opinions, their photos, their views of the world, and we won't be able to accomplish our mission. So keeping people safe is at the core of what we do, and many policy areas touch on this. At the same time, however, the notion of voice is also extremely important in our policies. It's really built into who we are as a company. We want to maximize people, the voice that people have. And I think in discussions about hate speech, other policy areas, it's really important to keep in mind the element of voice and this notion of balancing. We're trying to draw the line in the best possible place so that we can keep people safe while still allowing a robust voice on issues of the day. And this discussion may often be offensive to some people. It may be obnoxious. When you come to Facebook, we don't guarantee that you won't see opinions that you don't like or that you disagree with. That may well happen. We think that's an important part of freedom of expression, and we want to preserve space for that on Facebook. We do, however, make a commitment that when you come to Facebook, you'll feel safe. And that's why we tried to do the best possible line drawing to divide up those two areas. The other important point to make here is on equity. And this means a couple of things. It means having a system that we want people to regard as fair, even if they don't agree with every single decision that we make. I guess in this way, what we do at Facebook and the policy side could be likened to a legal system. We want people to have a sense of process. We want it to be as predictable as possible. We want to provide them information about the results of decisions that we make. And we want the overall experience to be one where people feel that the system is legitimate. You know, social scientists have told us that that experience of legitimacy and feeling that you're participating in a system that's fundamentally fair is extremely important and can make up for a lot of dissatisfaction when people feel that they didn't actually get the result that they wanted. So this is one thing that we're trying to build into our system. The point of operable, let me say just a little bit about this. This goes to the issue of how our policies are going to be enforced. The reviewers who are out in the field, and there are thousands of them now, are looking at content on a daily basis. We want our rules to be as clear as possible so those reviewers don't have to exercise their own discretion when they look at content. We want them to know what the rules are and to be able to apply them in a way that we can feel confident. We know how the decisions are going to come out when we craft the rules. So we have a kind of a feedback loop with these reviewers. We'll listen to questions or concerns that they have if they feel that the rules aren't sufficiently clear. And then we'll try to fix the policies that we've got to make the rules clear. But fundamentally, we want to know that those rules are going to be applied as we intended. Precise language is very much the same point. We're trying to be as precise as possible, consistent with not overloading people with documentation. And we also want to have full process so that people have the information they need in order to make good decisions. The notion of explicable really goes to part of the reason why I'm here today. We want our community, our global community, to understand the policies that we've developed. We want them to understand the text as well as the reasons behind them and some of the challenges that we face in coming up with rules for our global community. You know, many times I will go into meetings with external groups or policy leaders and explain our policies and try to get them to see the difficult decisions that we have to make. It's very infrequent for me to actually convince one of those policymakers that we are in the right place. We understand that. But what I hope to accomplish is to get them to see the very difficult shades of gray that we work with and increase their appreciation for how hard we're trying to get to the right place, and the difficulty in balancing the values that we have to deal with. So I'll now say a bit about policy development and implementation. And let me start off by explaining a little bit more about my particular function at the company within the product policy team. About a year ago, we decided it would make sense to create a smaller team within product policy devoted specifically to the challenge of stakeholder engagement. That means going out and talking to groups about our policies, listening to their opinions, and giving them visibility into the content of the policies and how we develop the policies. So that's the focus of my role these days. We run a process, which I'll say more about, whereby we go through and get expert input and stakeholder feedback on all of the policies that we develop and include into the community standards. So that's my perspective. I'm going to be spelling that out in more detail as we now talk about the policy process. And I want to spend time on this because we often get questions about how we come up with our policies. It's a very fair question and concern that people have. We are making rules that govern important speech for millions and millions of people. And I think people like you and the rest of our community have a very good reason to ask how it is that we come up with those rules. So that's what I'm going to try to lay out for you now. We have a 4-step process that begins with ideation, development, launch, and then post-launch. Ideation just basically means, well, let's see. Okay, let me skip ahead to ideation. I'll cover those other elements of the slide as I go along. Ideation just basically means where are we getting the ideas that end up being our policies. They could come from internally. It could be a policy manager in Europe or Asia saying, you know, I'm hearing from the people that I deal with on the ground that this policy is not working well. We're taking down too much content. We're not taking down the type of content that we should be taking down. So we need to rethink this. We could get a press report. The press frequently draws our attention to mistakes that we've made or policies that are difficult to understand. And so we go back and rethink them. Let me give you a specific example of this that I think is relevant here. A couple of years ago, in the wake of the Syrian civil war, we started hearing news reports and significant concerns in Europe about hate speech directed to migrants. So that kicked off a very serious process for us of trying to decide what was the best way to protect migrants on our platform while still allowing room for discussion about the political issue of immigration, which we think is important. That's one particular example of how this process begins. We then start to talk to external stakeholders who have an interest in the policy area, and we begin gathering resources internally so that we can try to make the best decisions possible. We then dig in deeper and try to get a good understanding of how the issue manifests itself on our platform. If we're worried about hate speech being directed against migrants, what exactly are people saying? What is the context? What are the photos that they're using? What are the types of political speech that we're seeing alongside what might be considered hate speech? We try to dig in deep and get a good understanding of what it is that we're dealing with. We'll also do a review of existing policy language, and we'll talk to people who manage review teams out in the field, what we call our market reps, to get their very fine-grained analysis of how these problems are cropping up in their countries. And we begin to talk to experts on the content policy team, as well as people from CO, which is the shorthand for community operations, the very large team that enforces the policies, and also community integrity. That's the team that builds the tools that we use, both for reviewers to see content and also for us to prepare automation that can help us to identify content that may be violating. So as the policy process kicks into high gear, all of these inputs are part of it, and they all work together to revise the policies that we think may need to change. So now let me turn attention to what we call the Content Standards Forum, which is really sort of the crossroads for where all of these efforts come together. We run a process every couple of weeks whereby numerous people within the company get together to discuss policy changes that we have in the works. We'll typically start off the process by announcing that we're going to investigate a particular area, and then different working groups will go off and analyze, investigate, takes the steps that I've just mentioned, and then they'll come back and they'll have kind of a wrap-up meeting where we will finally adopt the recommendation or go back and say, no, this one needs more time, we have to consider this further. We've now started releasing the minutes of this meeting publicly. So if you want to see what the meeting looks like, we can direct you to where the minutes appear, and you can see exactly how the discussion goes and what decisions people arrive at. So this brings into play expertise both from our worldwide policy apparatus and from individuals on the broader product policy team who may have backgrounds in law enforcement, human rights, working for NGOs, academia in some cases. All this information goes together into the policy development process. This is a kind of a depiction of the overall process, beginning with a heads up, through the working group stage, and ultimately leading to a recommendation. And when the recommendation is passed, we'll then incorporate the revised language into the community standards, and we'll go out and we'll begin a process of training our reviewers so that they know what the new language looks like, and they can begin to incorporate it into their daily work. Okay, let me try to pick up the pace here. We then will launch the policy. We'll go out and we'll test it. We'll try to determine whether we're actually achieving our goal. We're catching the stuff that we intended to catch, or we're leaving stuff on the platform if we decided that we wanted to allow more latitude for speech. Are we accomplishing our goal? We test for that, and we try to confirm that we've hit the mark. Okay. For a long time, we released a fairly summary, brief public version of our policies, and then we had a more detailed internal version that reviewers actually used in order to review content. Earlier this year, we decided to make the entirety of the standards public, and so if you go on the website now, you'll see what the reviewers have at their disposal in order to do the review. We decided that this was really important because we're trying to be more transparent, and we're trying to raise the level of dialogue around our standards. We decided that even though there may still be concerns about people gaming the system, about people trying to take advantage of this added transparency, it was worth the risk because we wanted people to understand the policies at a deeper level so that we could deal with questions in a more full way, and people would feel like they were really brought into the policy making process more completely. So let me now spend some time digging into the policy that is of relevance today, and that's our policy on hate speech. It's got a couple of pieces here, and again, I don't know if you can really read this. I apologize once more for not having this in front of you, but I promise you it's available on the website, and you can look at this. The policy rests on two pillars. The first is the notion of a protected characteristic. And if you look at the italicized language here, you'll see this spelled out. We define hate speech as a direct attack on people based on what we call protected characteristics: race, ethnicity, national origin, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, sex, gender, gender identity, and serious disability or disease. We also provide some protections for immigration status. We define attack as violent or dehumanizing speech, statements of inferiority, and calls for exclusion or segregation. Attacks are separated into 3 tiers of severity described below. So I'll talk about the attacks in a second, but for now the fundamental point to understand is that there needs to be a protected characteristic in the picture for us to apply the hate speech policy. And when we talk about protected characteristic, we're talking about people. with those characteristics. We draw an important distinction between people and institutions, principles, or ideas. So we don't allow people to say Muslims are evil. However, if people want to attack a religion, a concept, an idea, and say Islam is evil, we allow people to do that, because we think that to take speech about Islam off the table would be going too far, and would be really restricting people in having a political dialogue that's important. However, when it crosses the line into attack on an individual, that's when this portion of our hate speech policy kicks in. So now let me spend some time talking about the notion of attack. And it's broken down into 3 tiers or levels, and I'll explain why that's important. Tier 1 attacks consist of attacks targeting a person or a group of people who share one of the above listed characteristics or immigration status, including all subsets except those described as having carried out violent crimes or sexual offenses, where attack is defined as. And I'm not going to go through all the various attacks, but you'll see Tier 1 attacks are the most serious type of attack. So that's violent speech, calls for violence, dehumanizing speech, reference and comparison to various types of animals, insects. This is the highest level of speech, of hate speech, and the type of attack that we take the greatest pains to protect people from. Tier 2 consists of attacks targeting a person or group of people who share any of the above characteristics, involving a statement or term implying a person or group's physical, mental, or moral deficiency, or expressions of contempt, expressions of disgust. So for example, I hate. X group is the worst. X group is disgusting, vile, lazy. All those constitute hate speech if directed against a protected characteristic, and we'll remove that from Facebook when we get a user report or when we identify it ourselves. Tier 3 attacks are calls for segregation or exclusion. This is a type of attack that may lead to removal of content in certain cases. For protected characteristics other than migrants, we will remove speech that calls for exclusion or segregation. So for example, blacks shouldn't be allowed in this school, or Mexicans should go back to Mexico. Those types of speech, that type of speech is not allowed under our policies. However, here we draw a distinction, and for migrants, we do allow people to call for exclusion of migrants. Immigrants go home. If we were to apply Tier 3 to the protected characteristic of migrants, it wouldn't allow people to have a political discussion about immigration. So this is the way that we've tried to draw the line, to permit political discussion, but to protect migrants from the most severe forms of hate speech that they might face on the platform. A couple of other details here about how we're applying hate speech. The traditional model for us is to receive user reports, to review those, and then to either remove content when it violates our policies, or to allow the content to remain on the platform if it doesn't. We're now going beyond that in a number of important areas, and it's key to understand why. If content violates our policies, we don't want it on the platform. In particular, we want to remove it before people have to see it, before they have to report it to us. So we're being more aggressive in many ways, consistent with still making good decisions and not cutting into free expression. Some areas are very easy for us to be, or relatively easy for us to be proactive on, using automation. For example, nudity or spam. We can come up with a classifier that will identify with a high degree of certainty that type of content, and then we're able to remove it before anybody has to see it. We've also now taken significant strides to achieving the same kind of success in the area of terrorist propaganda. We're able to identify photos that come from terrorist propaganda sources. put them in a bank, and if they come up again, we remove them before anybody has to see them. We've had a lot of success in this, and we've documented the numbers on that. Hate speech is more complicated. It's definitely more challenging because context is so important. If you think about a slur, for example, that could be used as an attack of hate speech, or it could be used as a joke about yourself or a member of your own in-group. And we don't want to take down more than we should. So we can't just push a button and remove all hate speech from the platform. We are, however, getting more sophisticated and more aggressive in using automation to identify possible hate speech, which will then be enqueued for review by human reviewers. That way, we get the benefit of increased scope from automation, and we still have reviewers actually looking at content and making detailed decisions based on the maximum amount of context possible. So if you look down at the bottom, we've started to identify how much of the content that we remove in certain areas originated with a proactive detection. So in other words, if every single piece of content that we removed was identified by a machine, then that number would be 100%. And if we didn't use automation at all, it would be 0, okay? Currently, you can see that the dark blue portion of the ring here represents the proportion of content that we remove as hate speech based on proactive detection using automation. So that number has increased from 24% about a year ago, and it's now at about 52%. It's still not as high as we would like it. It means that in 48%, we only removed hate speech after somebody reported it to us. We would like that number to be higher because we don't want anybody to have to report it, ideally. Nonetheless, it represents the kind of step-by-step approach that we're taking here so that we can try not to go too far, too fast, overstep the boundaries of what the technology will actually allow us to do. Okay. Let me also kind of parenthetically talk about appeals. This is something that goes hand in hand with our increased use of automation because we recognize that as we get more aggressive in some areas, we may make mistakes. We definitely make mistakes, and we want people to be able to draw those mistakes to our attention so that we can fix them. So we started to roll out appeals across a broad sector of policy areas. And we now make it possible for people whose content has been removed in certain areas to tell us about it so we can take a second look. The current scope for that is nudity or sexual activity, hate speech, graphic violence, dangerous organizations or individuals, that's terrorism, bullying and harassment, regulated goods, which means pharmaceuticals, tobacco, and spam. So if you have content removed under any of those policy areas, you'll be able to click a button, get us to take a second look, and if we got it wrong, we'll restore the content. This is not as far as we would like it to go. There are other policy areas where we also need to provide appeals, and we also have a plan to provide appeals for people who have reported content. In other words, if you see something you didn't think should be on Facebook, you reported it, we didn't take it down, we want you to be able to appeal that as well, because we equally may be making a mistake in that area. So that's something that we're working on. We're not quite there yet. Okay, finally, let me talk about some issues of particular relevance to this audience. I've been discussing all of the steps that we take to apply our policies. And the policies are the focus of what we do in product policy. There are, however, a number of important areas where our work intersects, if you will, with local law. We're mindful of local law and respectful of local law. And in the typical case, the way we accommodate those is using a process that was referred to earlier called geo-blocking. If we receive a report under local law from a court or other authoritative agency, we'll examine it, and if it violates local law, we're convinced that that is an appropriate legal action, we'll make that content unavailable in that particular country where the law exists. Now, many countries have many different laws that affect content on our platform. I'm sure you're familiar with examples in Europe, blasphemy in Pakistan. There's a wide variety. So there's a process here that we respond to. You know, fundamentally, if it doesn't violate our policies, then we're going to look at the request strictly, because we draw our policies as carefully as possible, and we want local authority to show us in detail and with good authority why they think that content should be made available in their country. But if those standards are met, then we'll remove the content. So that's an important backdrop to understanding how we operate here in Europe and other regions throughout the world. Another thing that is, I think, helps to give a broader picture here is the work that we've been doing under the Code of Conduct test that you may have read about. This is a pan-European effort to measure how well the tech companies are doing when it comes to responding to and removing illegal content under various European jurisdictions. We've been participating in this for some time. I think it's really helped us in a variety of ways. The content comes to us from both civil society organizations and governmental authorities. We review it using our policies and, if applicable, local law. But by working with civil society, we have gotten better at understanding their concerns and seeing the landscape as they see it in terms of content to be concerned about in the area of hate speech. So the most recent statistics available came out earlier this year as a result of the third monitoring exercise. And we feel that these results really reflect that our systems are working well and that we're able to respond promptly. In this test, Facebook removed 78, almost 80% of the content that was flagged for it by NGOs and governments in Europe. We think this is a good sign. It's an improvement and reflects the appropriate balance between free expression and ensuring that people are safe on the platform. And we were able to respond to people, giving them a notification in almost 100% of the cases, 98.4% of the cases, which means that we're letting people know that we heard from them, that we got their request, and that we came to a determination. So the Code of Conduct test is something that is continuing, and we feel like it's been a really important part of our efforts in this area. The last thing two other things I want to draw attention to. NetzDG, I think people are familiar with, is a German law that went into effect last year, and we started enforcing on it at the beginning of this year. It's something that we and many other civil rights groups, civil liberties groups have concerns about for reasons that I'll spell out. But the initial point I want to make is that we're in full compliance with the law. We've set up a channel for people to report content that they think is illegal under German law, and we're reviewing reports that we get through that channel. We recently published an initial transparency report on how things are going under the law, and that covered the first 6 months of this year. And that report showed that we received, over those 6 months, about 1,700 pieces of content that was presented to us as illegal. And of that, we removed or blocked 21%. So, I mean, we have looked at German law, and we, as a team, feel that our policies align very well, and that we're confident that our policies reflect the fundamental concerns of German law. Nonetheless, we have taken all the steps that are required under the law and are enforcing it. If you look at the way that the law is drafted, concerns can arise, and we have questions about the approach of asking internet companies to make determinations of what is illegal under German law. There are very tight time frames for us to evaluate content under this law. In some cases, it can be as little as 24 hours. In other cases, it's a week for less serious cases. We have questions about whether it makes sense to put us in that position, and there have been some cases arising under German law that bear out what may be a lack of clarity in some cases. So we're moving forward, we're in compliance, but it's a questionable area. And I think what's perhaps also important to underscore is that other countries around the world that may not have the same tradition of law that Germany has are looking at this as a potential model. And that's another thing that really gives rise to questions on our part. Finally, counterspeech is something that I hope will be discussed during the proceedings here. And by counterspeech, I mean speech that is directed to positive narratives, that seeks to outweigh or counterbalance hateful speech. You think of campaigns like the one around the Charlie Hebdo killings, many other cases where people have spoken out for good and used their voices. We think this is a wonderful way to use Facebook, and we're very, very supportive of these efforts. We're not content creators ourselves, but Facebook is absolutely an excellent mechanism for people to take advantage of if they want to put out their own counterspeech. So we participate in and support counterspeech efforts throughout the world. One of the major ones in Europe is the Online Civil Courage Initiative that you may be familiar with. So this is, I think, an important point to make to backdrop all the work that we're doing to remove content. We also want there to be more good content, because at the end of the day, no matter how good we are, there will still be an important place for positive messages to draw attention to the evils of hate-filled messages and to counteract hate speech that may exist on the platform. So that's a quick overview of our policy work and our policies in the relevant areas, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.